Afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the intersection of preparedness, recovery, pandemics, and climate events. My name is John Kashmar. I'm with the Southeast New England Network. Just very briefly, the network is focused on training and technical assistance for stormwater management, and we're focused in Southeast Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And our vision is to build resilient ecosystems and connect communities through action, collaboration, and innovation, and really have a mission for empowering communities to achieve healthy watersheds, sustainable financing, long-term climate resilience through management of stormwater and restoration projects. You can find out more about us at snepnetwork.org. And the SNEP network is very glad to be co-hosting this webinar with others. I'd like to introduce Joanne Throw. Joanne joins us from Bristol, Rhode Island. She's a core team member of the SNEP network, working on innovative financing and leadership development. Joanne is president of Throw Environmental, as well as senior fellow at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy's Center for Global Sustainability. Joanne's past experience includes serving as Deputy Secretary for the Maryland Department of Natural Resources and Director of the Mid-Atlantic Region's Environmental Finance Center. Joanne currently chairs the US EPA's Environmental Finance Advisory Board that's responsible for providing innovative financing recommendations to the administrator of US EPA. She also serves as co-chair of the National Stormwater Finance Task Force for US EPA. We're also very pleased to have the Association of Climate Change Officers, ACO, who's co-hosting this lunchtime webinar series with us. And ACO is a premier professional development organization for individuals addressing climate change in their organization. And we look forward to today's conversation very much. And now I'd like to turn it over to Joanne to get us started.
Thanks, John. Appreciate your time, everyone, being on this webinar. Dan, my co-host, you are awesome. Thank you for working closely with us on these lunchtime webinar series. We have some very powerful people here joining us today, and we have a powerful listening group, including Judith Krieger. I believe she is out there, and I want to give a shout out to Mom, who is joining us, and your son is amazing. Dan, every time, besides having a sense of humor I don't always get, she will relate to this, but you ask him anything on sustainability and climate preparedness, and he is the man. He has the answers because he knows such wonderful people like my special guest today. And Dan, we're gonna have a lot of fun in this conversation in the next hour. Unfortunately, one of our guests had a last minute change. She had an emergency meeting for Boston, and she is unable to join us. She gave us such great information as we prepared for this today. Nancy Smith for the City of Boston. She will join us on a future webinar, so look forward to hearing from her in the near future. She is amazing at the very local level, but we have so much to talk about today, right, Dan?
Yeah, absolutely. And for those of you who are interested in hearing from Nancy, hopefully if she doesn't pulled into another emergency meeting, we have her on the ACO's Climate Superheroes webcast on Monday, and we'll be able to share that with folks as well.
So Dan, we have two superheroes in and of themselves. It's been a pleasure. I know Lisa from work in Baltimore City, and she is a powerhouse in and of herself. Nancy is the Director of Sustainability for Baltimore City, and Nancy has a real pulse on the issues of sustainable issues. I'm sorry, Lisa.
Fort Lauderdale.
I'm sorry? Oh,
Lisa's Baltimore, Nancy, Fort Lauderdale.
No, didn't Baltimore City. What? Let's keep going. So, Baltimore. I'm on you, Lisa. I'm sorry if I'm getting names incorrect here, but Lisa has worked, I don't know, maybe 20 years or so in various capacities from Berkeley, and you've been in the Grand Canyon all the way to West Africa, I recall. So working on energy and climate policy, so we're thrilled to have you here. Nancy Gassman, Dr. Gassman, you have been there, done that, have done it all, and your work in Florida has really been impressive. You are currently the Assistant Public Works Director for Sustainability for the City of Fort Lauderdale. So your work on adaptation strategies and climate resilience, your operations with the city, but you also have that county experience, so that perspective, just really fascinating. So we're looking forward to today's conversation. And what I'd love to do, because you are both coming from very different perspectives, what I think Dan and I, what we'd love to hear is take 2 minutes, just a couple minutes to frame out exactly your roles. So as we move forward in this conversation today, we understand what you're responsible for. Nancy, why don't we start with you?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me be here, and hello to everyone up in New England. I am the Assistant Public Works Director for the City of Fort Lauderdale. I have a rather unusual scope because I have fleet services under my purview, solid waste, environmental and regulatory affairs, sustainability and climate resilience, as well as stormwater operations. But it really provides an opportunity to see the breadth of how different aspects of public works feeds into how you deal with climate concerns moving forward. I'm the city's de facto resiliency officer, but my main focus is related to how sea level rise is impacting the city.
Thanks, Nancy. Lisa, I've known you in such different capacities. So talk a little bit more about your work in Baltimore City. You're doing such an amazing job. I'd love to hear the breadth of your scope of work with the city.
Right, thank you, and thanks for including me in the webinar. So in Baltimore, our sustainability office is in a very different place in government. We're in the planning department. And so that means that I do climate change, climate action, resiliency, a lot of the trees and sort of natural, sort of green and nature side of things. It means that we do a little bit less of the operational side, fleet services, so we view our general services and our public works as partners in what we do. But it also means then that I do environmental permitting. So the floodplain permitting is in our office. Interestingly, or somewhat unusually, the all hazard mitigation planning for the city is also out of my office. And so we've been able to connect that then to climate change and to really be at the table for some of these conversations in ways that we might not have if we were in a different location.
So thank you, ladies, appreciate it. Nancy, I'm gonna go back to you. So your work, you have spent so much time going through and preparing for different crises, and also preparing for different climate events, and really trying to keep Florida safe. But as you take this, and I mentioned before, you've been there, done that, and you've taken every experience on your recovery plan. So how can we take from what you've done and apply it to the current crisis we're in right now with the pandemic?
So this has been a particularly challenging year for the city of Fort Lauderdale. We had a utility break our raw water line that provided all the water for the city in June of last year. That was followed by Hurricane Dorian in September, and then in December we have a 54-inch sewer main, force main that broke, creating a problem on the other end of the city, and then we come into this crisis with COVID-19. The thing that they all have in common is this requirement that everyone has to work together in order to address the concerns, and there's also a lot of unintended consequences when you're dealing with these kinds of issues. So I think that one of the interesting aspects of dealing with any crisis is that you have a game plan. Usually people have some kind of a game plan ahead of time, COVID-19 didn't have a great game plan, and it needed to be dealt with on a fairly short time frame. And a lot of the work that I've done in the past for climate concerns brings in this idea of having a game plan that is taking place over months and years and decades in order to address this coming concern of climate concerns.
Nancy, your comment about forces people to really be more effective working together is so spot on. You know, there's that proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, you go together. And you know, Lisa has actually you've taught our vulnerability assessment content within the ACO training programs. Lisa McNeely has taught our organizational change and stakeholder engagement content. And it's just so fitting based on a lot of roles that she's had across multiple sectors that require that sort of collaboration. Lisa, I'd love for you to share some of your insights on that.
So related to what we're facing now, or just more generally?
Yeah, more generally, the commonality of having to work together and the change management that this drives.
Yeah.
Or should.
Yeah, so I mean, so Baltimore's preparation around emergencies has been driven by the fact that we're seeing a lot of riverine flooding driven by climate change. And so we were seeing a lot of stuff, fairly smaller incidents more frequently. But we also have such a greater social vulnerability in our city, more people at the edge. We are currently estimating that by the summer, we expect 1 in 3 people in the city to have food insecurity driven by unemployment, disruptions in regular sort of patterns and everything. And, you know, when you talk about the stakeholders and when Nancy talked about sort of needing to work together more, one of the things that had come to mind for me is again around the food insecurity and the work that's been happening, that even though we didn't have a game plan for this, that we found that even some of the things that we had done a little bit of planning on, or had some sort of relationships, or because of that stakeholder engagement in place, really were served as springboards for us to be more flexible and more agile in sort of pivoting from, gee, we think about flooding, to thinking about a pandemic, which is in our all hazard mitigation plan, but is really not mentioned very much at all. It was not planning we had done. So, for example, we have on my staff, we have somebody who does urban ag, we have somebody who does resiliency helps. Some of these resiliency helps were already feeding people, sometimes as little as 50 meals a day, 50 meals a week. And so we had those relationships, and as there's been a more concerted effort, we've been able to rely on those to figure out how to take steps to respond in this current crisis.
So Nancy, I want to ask you, when we were having a conversation and you made the comparison for how you address climate preparedness, and you know, it's an ongoing process, but yet the pandemic is right here, right now, everybody together, quick response. Looking at the two in comparison, you know, how do we best prepare? What are some of the things? You're constantly in a state of dealing with one situation, be it, you know, water mains that break, or king tides, whatever you're dealing with. How do we constantly stay ahead, one step ahead? What can we do?
One of my staff recently gave me a crystal ball, which has been extremely helpful in addressing these concerns. But I think that's kind of part of it. You need to have people with an imagination to be able to consider other types of scenarios, and you need to set aside time to do that type of scenario planning and discussion so that you can start to anticipate what those concerns may be. With climate, especially within the city of Fort Lauderdale, for us, there are climate projections related to sea level rise where we can say, okay, let's take some time and talk about what does 2-foot sea level rise do to the city, and start to build data around those concerns. And a pandemic is similarly adept at using scenarios. I don't know that anyone imagined that we'd be in this particular situation. In South Florida, the area in Miami recently went through the Rockefeller 100 cities resiliency process, and they included pandemics in their resiliency plan. But the pandemic that they had in mind was Zika. And how do you deal with a pandemic of that type? But a pandemic of COVID-19 is very different. And so they did not imagine how you could deal with this type of an issue. And that's why I say having people with an imagination and willing to talk about different scenarios and start thinking through those issues is really valuable. And I find that people taking the time to do blue sky planning in advance of that type of work, and Lisa mentioned this idea of all hazards, you have to be creative in thinking about what those hazards might be and spending time doing scenario planning with usually multidisciplinary groups to be able to tease out what those potential consequences are and what are some of the potential game plans that can address those concerns.
You know, there are some areas where we actually have done that, not so much in the environmental space, but we did it with Y2K, where everybody saw this potentially world-changing event coming that could shut everything down. And all organizations went through this process of figuring out what's going to happen to every system we depend on when the clock sets 0. And they went through it, and every institution was doing it for 2 years. And it required business units left and right working together with an IT command center driving it, and that happened. It's happened to some degree with active shooter training and some of the post 9/11 stuff. So we have envisioned scenarios of disruption and how we deal with it at an acute level. For some reason, when it comes to the environmental disaster realm, we tend to look at something we've experienced, but not look at the attributes that might inform that the sort of what is in the realm of possibility or the cascading impacts. So what do you think what's the gap, and how do we get people to not just, it's one thing to look backward and learn from experience. It's another thing to look backward and assume that what happened in the past is what happens in the future, non-stationarity. And what do we do to fill that gap?
I think Lisa can probably answer this better than I can. I'm just going to make a quick comment, is that there are people in the central states that have been hit by tornadoes in the last couple of days, and their emergency managers probably did not imagine dealing with what is a customary disaster for them, not a happy disaster, but a customary disaster. They're used to planning and planning for tornadoes. But how do you deal with a tornado or a hurricane or a tsunami in the context of social distancing? And we're currently going through that thought process right now about, okay, if we have a hurricane in the next 2 months and we're still in this situation of social distancing, how do we manage the emergency management piece of it? And then how do we manage the response? And I'll let Lisa jump in on the non-stationarity piece of this.
Well, you know, the first thing I thought of, Dan, when you were talking about with the Y2K, you know, we know that they planned for it. We don't know how well they planned for it because we didn't actually have the disaster. And that's not to take away from that planning that happened. And I think that's some of what we're seeing. I think what a lot of people are finding out is that we didn't plan well enough for a pandemic. And I think that having, you know, one of the things I'd been, you know, one of the things that happened when I was at UC Berkeley is that I got emergency management training, not as a sustainability person, but because the university's approach to that was that they wanted people spread out through the university. Yes. They wanted several people deep in all of the positions, and they, you know, they wanted that to happen. I think that's one step that could keep going. One of the things that's already happened in Baltimore is that there's one of the tasks on my to-do list is to identify who on my staff needs to take some, not just my staff, but all of planning, make suggestions of who needs to take that broader emergency management training so that we can be bringing more of those issues in. Again, I think Baltimore had already done some really good look at this layering, this threat multiplication when you have, whether it's a hurricane during social distancing. What we had was a power outage during a heat wave back in 2012. And so we already kind of had seen what that did, how much more that stressed our systems. We weren't fully prepared, but we were close. We had a food resilience planner on staff that came about from that 2012 and then the 2015 uprising after the death of Freddie Gray. So that while we didn't start with, oh, here's the plan for this pandemic, how do we deal with food insecurity, we at least had a starting point for it that I really do think has made a difference. So kind of back to my point of getting even some things in place can really help you get a little bit further along. So, and it's the same kind of thing. There was a meeting on Thursday in the city where we were doing code red planning, which is our heat wave planning, and thinking about it in terms of social distancing. I'm talking to sort of some of the staff I'm working with that even as we do start doing the after action report now for this COVID disaster, we'll start thinking about the fact, so what we ended up with was a distribution problem for food. We had, we kind there's pretty much food there. We know that some's being thrown away, some's being spoiled. It was a matter of getting it to the right people in a different way. What do we do if next time there's a supply issue? Even if it is, let's say we still have social distancing and we have an extended power outage in the city, either because we get hurt with a hurricane or something else, what that does to refrigeration and everything else, so that you maybe have supply and distribution at the same time. And so I think, again, I agree with Nancy, we're learning, but thinking about those, taking those tabletop exercises that emergency managers do, where they do pile those emergencies on top of each other, I think is something that we need to do more of, and have more of us who are not maybe traditional emergency managers in those conversations.
So Lisa, we do that a couple times a year in the city. Do you guys do that regularly in Baltimore?
I know they do some exercises. Our EOC gets activated fairly often with the flooding. I don't think we've done as much of it, but I haven't always been as involved here in that. But it's a good question. I'm going to be asking.
So, Dr. Gassman, so we had a conversation that included making that comparison to the Spanish flu of 1918, and we should have had a lot of lessons learned. I'm sure we did. A lot of takeaways that moved us forward, and then following up on what Lisa just said, just taking those lessons, moving in terms of preparedness. And, how can we learn again from this crisis that we are currently in?
Yeah, I think thinking about the fact that the 1918 Spanish flu was 102 years ago. And I think that we very strongly rely on community memory to help us address these kinds of incidents. I've lived in Florida. I was here about 2 years when Hurricane Andrew hit. And after Hurricane Andrew, we didn't really have a big hurricane for a number of years. And people got very complacent about how you prepare for a hurricane and what the issues are. But the people that had been through it were very anxious to get ready when they knew another one was coming. And so I think a lot of this has to do with, as a community, remembering what the impact was for any given event and using that experience to maintain a level of planning. Lisa was mentioning that that even some type of continuity of operation plan or some type of emergency planning at least gives you a foundation for thinking about the next event. And for this COVID event, we're going to start planning in the context of what we learned from COVID, but Miami Beach was thinking in terms of the Zika virus, and spent a lot of time thinking about sea level rise and flooding and hurricanes. So everybody relies on their experience, and this goes back to this idea of imagination. We have to imagine different things as we move forward.
But Lisa's comment earlier about envisioning supply disruption or envisioning distribution issues enables you to get to a scenario that could be created by 12 different catalysts, but
Yeah,
where
great
you,
idea.
and maybe that's part of the envisioning piece here. And I think, and then you add the cascading components to it. I'm as guilty as anyone, by the way, on Hurricane Andrew. We were, my family, Judge Judy, who's on the line, and the whole family, we were displaced from that. And Judge Judy and her husband, Dad, were also displaced from Irma. But in between, there was a numbing that took place through all of South Florida. That is an interesting challenge. The Dutch, when they had their major flood event in, I think, 1954, that killed 1,500 people, as a country decided never again. And you see them all around the world saying we're developing flood solutions well before anyone was talking about climate change, because they decided as a culture they were never going to be overcome by that again. There's something about an ability to maintain that in institutional and cultural memory that is important. And I'm wondering, what are the things that we do here? Because I think we do, like, either it didn't hit me, so it doesn't impact me, which is, I think, a distinctly American trait, or we forget.
The Dutch plan in 100-year increments. And in America, we do not plan in 100-year increments. We plan in 4-year increments. We plan in increments. We plan in 50-year increments. We don't plan in 100-year increments. And they've organized their funding in 100-year increments. And that makes a difference in that if you know the funding's there and you know you're planning for a long term, that planning takes place regularly.
Yeah, and I know that some major US cities have brought in the Dutch just to learn, and that could be one message right away that we take away is start planning out much further. Lisa, you were going to add on that?
No, sorry, I was a bad professional manager. I was reacting to a text about my pet at the vet.
Is your cat okay? That's the most important part here.
For the most part, he's coming back.
Okay, good.
Yeah, no, I think that you're right about the planning horizon, and I think that's what I think I'm hoping that, and I think we've already seen it in Baltimore by having that the disaster preparedness in the planning department. I think planning departments are in cities to try to think a little bit longer. We know that the departments of public works, general services, they get 311 calls every day. They get the calls from the city council when things aren't working. That's not what we get at the planning department, and hopefully that's a role that we can play in our city and maybe in other cities to sort of look 20, 30, we may not get to 100 years out, but certainly because that's a role that we play. I think that we can sometimes help bridge that a little bit, and hopefully can be successful at trying to do that.
But Lisa, you had a food resilience plan in place. You had preparations, right? So now and you said something to us the other day, we're in the middle of recovery. How do we talk about recovery? But I think now is the perfect time to begin this. So what are your takeaways, even all that you've said about your food situation, distribution, supply chain? What's your takeaway on how do we move forward for recovery and learn? What are you going to do moving forward?
Right. No, I mean, I think when you study emergency management, they tell you that you start planning for recovery from day one of the disaster, and that that's easier said than done sometimes. I think that what has potentially helped make that more sort of a straightforward process is that we don't know when this one's going to end, and so it's not about sort of through the end of May, through the end of June. It's I think does mean that we are taking a longer term look and anticipating a long time of significant food insecurity in the city. And so I think that has allowed, given everybody space to sort of pivot to thinking about some longer term kinds of work. And so, we started with, in the city, kind of grab and go. So we had to immediately replace meals for that's youth got in schools and that senior centers got in senior centers, with some grab and goes at some alternate locations, and have been working with our food bank, pivoting more to, they're currently calling backup boxes, but they don't really like the acronym, but that is 7 days worth of food for a family of 4, because even having somebody come every day and grab and go something, A, it's not hot, and B, they're still having to come in, they're getting out. Your social distancing goals are probably not being met as well. And so have been looking towards that, and I I think I applaud the people in the city who've been doing that. They did think big. They started thinking bigger than just continuing to give out those thousands of meals a day.
You mentioned earlier, and I called you for it, the supply scenario. That's not a theoretical scenario. We already know definitively that there are supply disruptions already happening, and we know that they are about to get dynamically worse on the meat side of the equation. And we're already seeing that the ag industry is struggling with getting stuff picked and processed. And so it's not just the meats. On the other side of it, certainly in a place like South Florida, we see people can't get food, and they're broke. They couldn't afford the disruption in paycheck that was 40% of Americans before this started. So we're already seeing that that's a today issue. There's another piece of this, because I know that there are folks who are on this call who aren't in cities the size of a Baltimore or a Fort Lauderdale. And relative to cities like New York, Baltimore and Fort Lauderdale are towns. But right, I mean, Fort Lauderdale is 160 some thousand people, and so I mean, in the grand scheme of big cities, super small. But there are towns that are much smaller. One thing that I think is worth talking about is the role of working together across boundaries and jurisdictions. And Nancy, when you and I first met, you were playing a huge role in the Southeast Florida Climate Compact. And I think it's worth mentioning how that even came about, and what you guys have been able to do across the 4 counties and the numerous municipalities of all sizes that wouldn't have happened on your own.
Yeah, the compact started because Miami-Dade and Broward, which are very large counties, they were trying to get federal funding, and they were going from door to door, and they were using a different set of statistics and a different set of projections to say, hey, this is the problem that we're having in South Florida, we need federal funding. And at that point, we recognized that all of South Florida has the same sort of challenges, and that we were stronger together than we were apart. And so the initial conversation was about policy, but it very quickly became recognized that there was real opportunities to provide technical support as well. And so over the last 10 plus years that the compact's been together, they've developed sea level rise projections, greenhouse gas projections for the region, and leveraged a lot of funding to be able to generate those tools that were not just for the counties. So I had done that work when I was at the county. And then when I came to the city, I continued to use the tools that were being developed by the compact for a region that had 110 municipalities to be able to say, okay, as a municipality, I don't have the funding to do my own sea level rise projection, but I can take this regional projection and adopt it into my everyday work and use that as my resiliency planning, because sea level rise projection is not going to be different for me than the municipality to the north of me or to the south of me. It's going to be the same for the region. It's big enough. So I think that one of the real values of the compact over time was that they were able to generate awareness, which helped the politicals, the elected officials have some cover, because the counties were saying, hey, this is a problem. It's not, and a county's not an independent agent. It's made up of cities and unincorporated areas. So there was a certain amount of political cover in having the compact be there. And then there was all of this technical information that they were generating that allowed people to start doing the planning and gave them some of the tools to be able to say, what does this mean for me in my municipality?
Yeah, thank you. And what I want to do is make sure as we continue this conversation, we take some questions from all of these great listeners who are enjoying their lunch. So please go ahead and submit your questions in the question box while we continue to ask our guests a few of our questions. So please send them in and we will try to get to all of them. But as I continue here, Lisa, I just want to check, we have just, Nancy's talking about the county involvement, and, I know with the state and all the engagement the state has had, and Baltimore City has some amazing leaders as well. So how is that leadership, that support, how necessary is it in supporting all of your sustainability efforts?
Yeah, so, Baltimore is, I think many of you all know, we're a city of 600,000, the largest city in the state, but not necessarily the largest county. We actually are an independent city. So we're not part of Baltimore County. They're a separate county, and we're sort of both a city and a county. It means that we probably one of the things that's often on the table is to be working more regionally, and as there's a new sustainability person in Baltimore County. We know that other offices across the county, and part of this is some of the ACO training that's going on too. We have a lot more people in the state working on climate change issues, and we'll certainly see that increase. Any municipality, any government entity always faces a lot of threats, and Baltimore is no different. I think people know what some of our non-sustainability related issues and vulnerabilities are, and what we do. We have a very active city council. We have a very involved city hall, and it's a very important thing to do, but it's also incumbent upon us to make sure that we tie the work that we're doing to those other goals and to those other threats, to make sure that it's not just us kind of talking in a circle about our what we think needs to be happening, what the benefits that we see, but framing it in terms of what those broader benefits are, and that's an important way to message that, not just politically or with leadership, but also with the community. It's a way to avoid being too tone deaf in certain instances.
Yeah, Baltimore City has done an amazing job really engaging the community and having work groups really involved in decision making. So not just at the leadership level, but every level in between. So let's see if I have some questions coming in.
So in the absence of questions, the comment about recovery and using that to inform future activities, historically something like 94% of federal dollars are spent on recovery and not preparedness and prevention in the context of these sorts of disasters. If the disasters are increasing in frequency and magnitude, and separate and aside from the fact that climate change is actually making that be the case, the statistics decade over decade over the last 6 decades show that the number of billion-dollar disasters is increasing every decade. So we know that that's the case. At some point, we've got to shift our mindset from how do we recover more efficiently to how do we become more resilient to and adaptive to this on the front end, so that we're not constantly in really inefficient and super expensive recovery. And we're learning that right now on this pandemic. We could not have afforded to spend $10 trillion shutting down an economy. And that was for lack of preparedness, period. It was absolutely from lack of preparedness. And so that's going to cost us $10 trillion. I'd have rather have spent $50 billion up front than the $10 trillion in the hardship and the death that we're spending now. How do we start to shift that dynamic? There's got to be a change point here, and I think there's an opportunity to do that. But where are you seeing that might be early traction for that shift in mindset?
So for the city, we have, again, one of our bigger threats is sea level rise, and we adopt the regional projection for planning purposes every time it gets renewed, and it is included in every one of our major master plans. And to give you a sense of that, it's in the Parks Master Plan, it's in the Seawall Master Plan, it's in the Stormwater Master Plan, it's in the Sewer Master Plan, it's in the Water Master Plan, and most recently it's been included in the Cemetery Master Plan, because all of these issues are infrastructure lasts, depending on the infrastructure, 50 to 80 to 100 years. And if you don't consider the conditions of the future, you are going to be spending those public dollars more than once. And so that's one of the ways that we have dealt with it from the infrastructure side.
No, I would, that's great to hear, Nancy. I applaud that. I think that, we still have some ways to go on that in terms of, feeling like we're behind the 8 ball in a lot of areas, and, trying to play catch up in them and try to prepare. I think it's tough, and it's, I read somewhere somebody had the top 10 list of the things that the federal government could do, and one of the things they talked about was, if the federal government could sort of come up with a way to help fund cities' stormwater improvements, and talking about how many cities are just so much of their debt and their time is taken up on, dealing with that. And again, this is more of an East Coast older city issue, but addressing that it could have such an impact for allowing cities to be more kind of proactive and thinking longer term about other things.
Yeah.
So Nancy, I wanted to hit you up with telling a story that you were telling me the other day, where I had been looking at some news clips, and they were talking about the markers here in New England. We know so well that we mark snow, so that we put it on the edges of our roads and whatnot. And here you are trying to get a hold of as many as you can, and they're certainly not for the purposes of snow. In Florida, it's for other reasons. And, what required that to happen? I just want to tee you up with that story. I think it's a fantastic story to share with our audience here.
Yeah, so the city has a number of what are considered city-owned seawalls, and those seawalls run parallel to thoroughfares. And when we have significant tidal events, you cannot tell the difference between the canal or the waterway and the roadway. The roadway becomes flooded, and unless you notice that there's a boat in the road, that's actually the canal. And so one of the things that we do to try to address these concerns during the fall seasons, when we do get a lot of these high tides that end up inundating those roads, is we put out what we call delineators, orange poles with reflective tape on the top that we put along the edge of pavement so that people stay on the road and they don't wander off into a deep canal or waterway. And we were trying to get more of them in the middle of last king tide season, because we had an unprecedented season last year. Tides came in higher, and they came in substantially more frequently than they had the year before. We had roughly 3 times the number of inundation events last fall than we did the year previous. And so we were trying to order some more of what we call delineators, these poles. And the person that I was working with had only lived in South Florida, and I grew up in Minnesota. So she's looking and looking, and she's like, oh, they're like $3 a piece, and I can't find enough. And I said, well, look up snow poles. And she looked at me like I was a little crazy, and I said, no, look up snow poles. And she was able to find these snow poles for a third of the price in great quantities by just looking under a different name for this device that we use to try to keep people from driving into the canals.
Well, so I wanted you to tell that story because there's so many small things we could do to address, problems, but those small things add up to big responses eventually. And, can you both think of other things that could be small actions that could amount eventually to big results?
Specific to climate or in addressing
I would
COVID?
say, I think both. We can cover both. I've stumped you.
No, I think there's lots of small things. It may sound ridiculous, but we put out no wake signs in the middle of the roadways. And the reason, that's about a $50 investment. But what happens is that when large cars go through those flooded roadways, they throw a wake up, and that wake ends up going into people's homes that have low elevations in their finished floor. And so those no wake signs end up saving private property through a fairly insignificant investment by the city. So that's a small thing. We do a lot of awareness communication. We send out every August, and then at the beginning of each month through the king tide season, we send out a notice of what we believe are the predictable dates for when we're going to see those king tides. And that makes a huge difference as well in terms of people being able to have an expectation that there may be flooding in their neighborhood. And so that's an opportunity as well. And that, again, not a high cost item, and it's something that helps people understand what their options are. We send out a postcard that has the dates, but on the back side of it, it says, these are the things that you can do to stay safe. These are the things you can do to save your own property. These are the things you can do to avoid damage to your personal property.
Yeah, it's not always just the big things that we need. It's all the little things. I have a question for you. Isn't there a big federal water infrastructure bill pending? Could be an opportunity to address some resiliency issues while also providing economic stimulus. Anyone care to comment on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can't comment on this one's particularly, but I do know that there's also the new BRIC response, kind of back to Dan's question about kind of doing preparedness. And I wish I could cheat and remember what BRIC stands for, but it is an effort on behalf of the federal government to try to get more funding into the preparedness. I think any of these times where, as cities, I'm not involved in any kind of lobbying on federal legislation, but I think any of these large efforts to look at these infrastructure issues and find, when we can sort of make sure that they're written such that they can help rather than hurt, resiliency and planning is always a good thing. Obviously, this BRIC funding is very specifically about that, but it's, and I know we're at 9 minutes in and this isn't fully responsive to your question, but I am going to raise something that we haven't quite talked about, which are sort of the issues around equity. I think we've talked around them and we're all aware of them, but just did want to sort of say, I think that's another aspect to all of this that, I think we've started having conversations in our office where people are saying like, oh, what's the new normal going to look like? And we have other people saying, hey, time out. I think we've just seen that normal is not what we want to go back to, and not just from a, gee, we've reduced emissions and look how clean some of these cities are, and but from the kinds of things that we've seen that the essential workers that we're sending out every day to feed, to clean in the hospitals, to stock the grocery stores and everything, are ones that we're not paying enough to do that. We're not, all the people who've lost their health care insurance, all the people who, are facing unemployment and don't have that $400 or don't have the kind of backup. And how is it, want to make sure that in addition to thinking about resiliency, that we really are thinking about what that needs to look like, and what it is that we can be doing. In Baltimore City, I don't know the number, but we have a significant number of school children, school kids who were sent home to do online learning who don't have access to a computer, or who have a smartphone and don't have reliable access to Wi-Fi. And that's not right. And that can't be the normal that we go back to. So sorry, you didn't ask that question, but I answered it.
That's fantastic. And
you're spot on, but this is a combination of inequity and also failure in systems thinking, and it's both piled into one. And we don't have to have we seem to be acting like there's always an either or an or. Like we can't invest in this because it costs us that, and that leads to inequities. It leads to short-term thinking. We can't be a foot in today and a foot in tomorrow. We can't do long-term planning and have incremental gains short-term. We can't put money in infrastructure here because then we don't have the money to do it there. And then what ends up happening is we end up prioritizing in a way that is the way we've always prioritized where assets go, and that furthers the systemic inequities that are out there. And it's nuts that the most advanced society on the planet is not figuring that out. And I think that leads to Jerry Schechter's question here, because if we're used to thinking about things in a particular way with a particular name, how might it change my way of thinking without some kind of external push or perspective? And equity and the absolute health and security and prosperity components of all of this should be the lens that drives that thinking. How do we make that happen? Because the way of thinking of old, Lisa, to your point, can't continue. Big question.
I think
go ahead, Nancy.
If you're trying to ask yourself, how do you change the way that you think? There's the 5-year-old test where you ask yourself why 5 times. Ask a question and then ask why when you give the answer. Ask a question, and then ask yourself why. And if you think about this existing pandemic and you say, well, what did we do well? Why was that something we did well? What did we not do well? How do we get to the next thing? What if? And you start asking yourself the what if question. What if we did it this way? What if we did it that way? But you have to be willing to have very open conversations that may gore someone's ox because there was an opportunity for someone to do better. And to have those kinds of really open conversations, you have to build a lot of trust. And I'm really fascinated that you guys have this SNEP network there in New England, where you have a lot of partners who have a lot of different perspectives. And you have people who can ask an innocent question, which can lead someone to start thinking differently about the work that they do.
I have another question coming in. What are the key risk choke points that lie at the intersection of COVID and hurricane vulnerability? And what can, I don't know, I think that should have been citizens do to support, somebody is writing this, and this, I think they're saying dampening the personal collective risks. So I'm apologizing to the person who sent that in, but there's a few typos that I'm not quite sure what that means.
I think you got it. I think you got it there.
So I think a couple of the points between hurricanes and COVID, one of the challenges we had with COVID is adequate supplies, where people went to the grocery store and they overbought. And we also see that in a hurricane scenario where the idea in a hurricane is you need 3 days. In COVID, people were buying 10 days of supplies for their homes. So right now, if we suddenly saw that there was a hurricane coming, we couldn't support in the current framework having everyone go out and buy 3 days of supplies, because we're not letting that many people into the stores, and the stores are having a supply issue. So to me, that would be a potential choke point. Being able to get your emergency managers ready to go would also be challenging, because you have to set up things as a collective group. That would be a potential choke point for us. A lot of the essential workers that are essential during a hurricane are already essential now, so we work through a lot of those procedures on how to keep them together, so I don't think that is as much of a choke point. But just off the top of my head from that question, those are two places that I would think, okay, that's going to be problematic if we get notice of a hurricane tomorrow.
That was terrific.
Joanne,
We've only got a couple minutes. I want to wrap up. Dan, you had something to say?
yeah, I want to come back to the equity issue, and I want to suggest an idea for everybody listening. A couple of weeks ago, I watched a movie called The Best of Enemies, and if you've never heard this story, I think the model here is something that people should look at. In 1971 in North Carolina, as desegregation of schools was being addressed in the community dialogue, there was about to be a court ruling that was going to drive some outcomes that would not have brought community together. And as a result, they went through a 10-day charrette in the community where there were functionally two sides of the argument. And one side of the argument was C.P. Ellis, who is the president of the KKK's North Carolina chapter, and the other side was Ann Atwater, who was a Black woman who was advocating for integration and representing the community that needed to be stood up for. And through that charrette, they were forced to participate in dialogues. And what ended up happening out of that is a really fascinating story in which C.P. Ellis actually renounces his role as the head of the KKK chapter and switches his vote to the other side. And it's not just the movie. This is actually what happened in real life. I went and researched it. I've read. It's really fascinating. And it's that level of dialogue at the community level because people are so disconnected from one another. This notion of community is lost, especially in bigger cities. And this should not be surprising that communities of color are being hammered by this pandemic, because we knew the underlying conditions were there, and the social dialogue ignored it. ACO has been teaching that climate impacts upon those same communities for years. And there's those charrettes, those dialogues are crucially important, and we're missing it. And it is a component of bringing the fabric and the will to have the broader planning and considerations and build the will and investments that need to take place. I'd absolutely encourage that sort of mindset and looking into it.
Yeah, and also we will have Nancy Smith back. I know she's listening. Her meeting finished late and she wasn't able to join us, but she is doing so much good work in Boston, looking at her 23 neighborhoods and all that's happening there, and the resources and the engagement that's occurring. So we'll bring her back and talk more about that. We are just about a minute over. I want to thank Nancy and Lisa. You were both terrific and full of information. I could keep this going on, this conversation. Dan, Mom wrote in saying, "Why do you always call me Judge Judy? I'm Mom."
I don't need to call her Judge Judy, but out of respect for what she's accomplished, I think everyone else should.
Anyway, Dan,
how about Judge Krieger?
This is great doing this with you, Dan. And today you gave me a hard time as we started because I was cold and I had so many logs on the fire and my face is red and burning. So serves me right. So I hope everyone will join next week, May 1st. We're coming back again. Dan, if I haven't given him enough hard time, are you showing us your lily?
I'm wishing people peace with my peace lily.
All right. And there we have it, folks. May 1st, 12 to 1. We are bringing in Lindeen Patton. She is an amazing woman, attorney with Earth and Water Law. And also we are bringing in Sean Carpenter, who is the climate economy advisor for the city of Fort Collins. So we're very excited to continue our lunchtime webinar series. Dan and Aiko, thank you so much. Lisa, I will see you soon in Baltimore City. And Nancy, please keep in touch. We love hearing your story. Thank you all.
Take care.